100 horsepower, 3 on the tree, a single-barrel carburetor feeding 6 cylinders in a row. These are not the specs that launched drag racing legends. Yet in 1968, a kid from Ohio named Dave Strickler rolled up to the starting line at National Trail Raceway in a bone-stock Chevy Nova with exactly those specs. His opponent? A 390 Mustang with triple the power. The tree dropped. The Nova hooked. The Mustang spun. And by the time the Ford driver found traction, Strickler's wheezing inline-six was already crossing the finish line. This wasn't supposed to happen. The muscle car era was in full swing. Detroit was cramming 427s into anything with 4 wheels. Hemis ruled the strips. Big blocks were the only path to glory, or so everyone thought. Because while the magazines were obsessing over superstock Plymouths and Copo Camaros, something interesting was happening in the shadows of small-town drag strips across America. Kids with no money and big dreams were discovering that Chevrolet's humble 250 cubic inch inline-six, the engine nobody wanted, the power plant that came in your grandmother's Impala, had a secret. The Chevy 250 wasn't built to dominate drag strips. It was engineered for economy, reliability, and the thankless job of hauling families to church on Sunday, but it became the most unlikely giant killer in drag racing history, not because of what it was, but because of what it could become, and more importantly, because of what it cost to get there. To understand how a grocery-getter engine became a bracket racing weapon, we need to go back to 1966. General Motors was in the middle of a transition. The old Stovebolt 6 that had served Chevrolet since 1929 was finally being retired. In its place came a completely new design, the Turbo Thrift family of inline-sixes. The 250 was the big brother of the lineup, stroked out from the 230's architecture with a 3.875-inch bore and a long 3.53-inch stroke. That stroke was key. While everyone else was going over square for high RPM power, Chevrolet built an under-square torque monster. The competition wasn't sleeping. Ford had their 300 cubic inch 6, a truck engine that had already proven itself in NASCAR. Chrysler offered the legendary Slant 6 in 225 cubic inches. AMC fielded their 232 and 258 sixes. But the Chevy 250 had something none of them could match: the small block Chevrolet's development budget. See, GM didn't design the 250 in isolation. They borrowed heavily from their V8 program. The rocker arms? Identical to the small block. The pistons? Same bore as a 307 V8. The valve sizes? Straight from the parts bin. This wasn't laziness, it was genius, because every hot rod part developed for the small block ecosystem could potentially work on the 6. On paper, the 250 looked pathetic next to its V8 siblings. In 1967, the base 250 made 155 horsepower at 4,200 RPM and 235 lb-ft of torque at a basement-low 1,600 RPM. Compare that to the base 283 V8 making 195 horsepower, and you understand why nobody gave the 6 a second look. The integrated intake manifold cast into the cylinder head meant you couldn't even bolt on a 4-barrel without major surgery. The log-style exhaust manifold choked flow worse than a kinked garden hose. The camshaft was designed for fuel economy, with duration so short it made the engine feel asthmatic above 4,000 RPM. But here's where it gets interesting. That long stroke that killed top-end power, it generated massive torque right off idle. While a small block needed to rev to 3,000 RPM to wake up, the 250 was already pulling like a tractor at 1 to 200. The 7-main bearing bottom end, one more than a small block V8, was practically indestructible. The forged steel crank could handle twice the factory power output without breaking a sweat. The head, despite its integrated intake, had surprisingly good port velocity at low RPM. And because it was an inline configuration, the engine was inherently balanced, requiring no heavy counterweights or balance shafts. The first racers to figure this out weren't the big names. They were kids working at gas stations, shade tree mechanics who couldn't afford a V8 swap. They discovered that a used 250 from a wrecked Impala cost about $50. A mild cam from Crane or Iski ran another $40. Headers from Hedman or Hooker, when you could find them for a 6, cost $35. Mill the head .06D for compression, recurve the distributor, and suddenly that wheezing 155 horsepower jumped to 200. Total investment? Less than $200. Now here's the genius part. These kids weren't racing superstock, they were running brackets, a form of drag racing where consistency beats raw speed every time. You dial in your expected elapsed time, and whoever runs closest to their dial without going under wins. A 450 horsepower big block that runs 1250 one pass and 1290 the next is useless. But a 200 horsepower 6 that runs 1520 every single time, that's a weapon. The 250's consistency came from its simplicity. One barrel meant no secondary transition issues. Inline configuration meant even fuel distribution to all cylinders. The massive rotating assembly acted like a flywheel, smoothing out power delivery. The long stroke meant the engine wasn't sensitive to shift points. It pulled the same whether you shifted at 4,500 or 5,500 RPM. And because peak torque came so early, launch technique was almost irrelevant. Sidestep the clutch at idle, and the engine just grabbed and went. But the real revolution came when Clifford Performance entered the picture. Jack Clifford was a mad scientist of inline-six performance, operating out of a small shop in California. In 1968, he did what Chevrolet said was impossible. He developed a removable aluminum intake manifold for the 250. This wasn't some hack job. Clifford machined the head surface flat, drilled and tapped for studs, and created a manifold that could accept anything from dual single barrels to a massive Holley 4-barrel. The kit cost $189, and it transformed the engine. Suddenly, the 250 could breathe. With Clifford's 4-barrel intake, headers, and a proper cam, output jumped to 275 honest horsepower. But horsepower was never the whole story. Torque, that's what won races. A built 250 could generate 340 lb-ft at just 2,800 RPM. To put that in perspective, a 327 small block needed to spin to 4,000 RPM to match that torque. And torque at low RPM meant one thing: traction. This is where physics got interesting. A 1969 Nova with a 250 6 weighed 2,975 pounds. The same car with a 3.986 big block weighed 3,240 pounds. All that extra weight sitting right over the front wheels. The 6-cylinder car had 52% of its weight on the rear wheels. The big block? Only 46%. In drag racing, weight transfer is everything. When you launch hard, weight shifts to the rear wheels. Starting with better balance meant the 6-cylinder cars could hook up with street tires, while the big blocks were still spinning $1,000 slicks. The establishment didn't take this seriously at first. Hot Rod magazine barely mentioned sixes. Carcraft ignored them completely. But at local strips from Ohio to California, something strange was happening. 6-cylinder cars were winning, not just in bracket races, but in heads-up competitions against V8s with twice the displacement. The secret was getting out. By 1970, the aftermarket exploded. Offenhauser offered a cross-ram dual-quad intake that looked like it belonged on a race boat. Crane cams developed specific grinds for the 250 that pushed duration to 280 degrees while maintaining street manners. TRW built forged pistons that bumped compression to 12.1. Howard's created aluminum rods that cut reciprocating weight by 40%. Headers evolved from simple tubes to sophisticated tri-Y designs that scavenged exhaust so efficiently the engine actually pulled vacuum at the exhaust ports. The numbers were getting serious. Larry Shinoda's personal 250, yes, the same Shinoda who designed the Boss 302 Mustang and Z28 Camaro, made 385 horsepower at 6,800 RPM on the dyno. This from an engine with 2 fewer cylinders and 100 fewer cubic inches than a 350 small block. How? RPM. The 7-main bearing bottom end could spin to 8,000 RPM reliably. The inline configuration meant no odd firing pulses or harmonic issues. The short stroke, wait, didn't we say it had a long stroke? Here's where things get clever. Racers discovered you could offset grind the crank, reducing stroke while increasing rod journal diameter. Combined with 292 Chevy truck rods that were 400 inches longer than stock, you could build a 250 that revved like a Honda but pulled like a diesel. The transformation was complete. The grocery getter had become a giant killer. The most famous build came from Don Francisco's speed shop in California. Starting with a bare block, Francisco sonic checked the cylinders and found he could safely bore to 3.9 to 35 inches, just 5/1000ths under a 327's bore. Using a distroked crank at 3.25 inches and custom pistons, he built a 237 cubic inch screamer that made peak power at 8,200 RPM. Compression hit 13.5.1. The cam had 590 lift and 312 degrees duration. The head was ported until it flowed 240 CFM, matching a stock double-hump small block head. On race gas, this combination made 425 horsepower, 425 horsepower. From a Chevy 6 in 1971, the transmission was crucial to making these combinations work. While everyone assumed you needed a 4-speed, the real secret weapon was the 3-speed manual, the 3 on the tree that came stock in poverty-spec Chevys. Why? Gear ratios. First gear in a 3-speed was 2.5 before 0.1. First in a 4-speed, only 2.20.1. That deeper first gear multiplied the 6's torque even further. Combined with 4.6 rear gears, a 3-speed 6 could outlaunch a 4-speed V8 every time. The pattern was always the same. 6 gets the jump, V8 starts catching up but runs out of track. Professional Stock Eliminator took notice. NHRA created specific classes for inline-sixes. The L-Stock automatic class became dominated by 250-powered Novas and Camaros, running mid-13s with nothing but headers and slicks. The higher modified classes saw full-race 250s running 10s at over 130 mph. These weren't flukes. Season champions were running 6s. The cost differential was staggering. Building a competitive 350 small block for bracket racing cost about $3,000 in 1971 money. A 250 that could run the same times? $800. That included machine work, pistons, cam, intake, headers, and carburetor. For the price of one V8 rebuild, you could build 3 complete 6s. When one broke, which was rare, you swapped in another and kept racing. But the real advantage wasn't just cost, it was the psychological warfare. Imagine pulling to the staging lanes in a primered Nova with steel wheels and no hood scoop. Your opponent sees the inline valve cover and starts laughing. He's got a built 454 with a tunnel ram poking through the hood. He knows he's got you by 300 horsepower. The tree drops. Your 60-foot time is 1.52 seconds. His is 1.78. By the time he realizes what's happening, you're already 3 car lengths ahead. His superior horsepower starts reeling you in after the 8th mile, but it's too late. You win by a fender. This happened every weekend at strips across America. The factory finally caught on in 1969. Chevrolet quietly released RPO F41, a heavy-duty 250 that nobody ordered because nobody knew what it was. This wasn't some radical high-performance variant. The changes were subtle: shot-peened rods, higher nickel content in the block casting, larger diameter valve stems, and a slightly more aggressive cam. Power only increased to 165 horsepower, but durability went through the roof. These engines could take 7,000 RPM pulls all day without complaint. Then came the most unlikely hero, the integrated head. Remember how everyone hated that you couldn't change the intake? Turns out that was an advantage. The intake runners cast into the head were incredibly short, just 4 inches from carburetor to valve. Short runners mean instantaneous throttle response, no plenum volume to fill, no distribution issues. When you stomped the gas, all 6 cylinders got fuel right now. V8 guys with tunnel rams and 8 inches of runner length couldn't match that response. The racing got serious enough that specialty builders emerged. Michigan's Inline Performance built nothing but 6s. Texas Speed 6 specialized in GMC 292 truck engine conversions, basically a 250 bored and stroked to 292 cubes from the factory. California's Clifford Performance expanded their catalog to over 200 parts just for the Chevy 6. You could buy everything from gear drives to dry sump oil systems specifically designed for the 250. The most extreme builds pushed boundaries nobody thought possible. Nitrous oxide systems designed for V8s were adapted to 6s. The long stroke and robust bottom end could handle 200-shot hits without breaking. Turbocharging entered the picture in 1973 when Ach Miller bolted a Rajay turbo to a 250 and made 475 horsepower at 15 psi. The inline configuration meant equal exhaust pulse spacing, perfect for spool-up. The iron head could handle heat that would melt aluminum V8 heads. But here's the thing about bracket racing. Innovation spreads fast. Once one guy shows up with a 6 and starts winning, everybody wants to know the secret. Within a year, half the field is running 6s. The playing field levels. The advantages disappear, except they didn't. Because the 250 had one more trick. Consistency at altitude. Denver's Bandimere Speedway sits at 5,800 feet elevation. The thin air robs naturally aspirated engines of 20% of their power. A sea-level 400 horsepower big block makes 320 at Bandimere. But remember the 250's torque curve? Peak torque at 2,600 RPM meant the engine wasn't relying on volumetric efficiency. It was relying on stroke, and stroke doesn't change with altitude. While V8s were gasping for air, the long-stroke 6 just kept pulling. The local bracket racing championship in 1972 won by a 250-powered Vega. The runner-up? Another 250, this time in a Camaro. The combinations got wilder as racers pushed limits. Someone figured out you could machine the block to accept small-block Chevy head studs and run aluminum V8 heads modified to fit. The port spacing was wrong, but with enough welding and grinding, you could make it work. Another discovered that Mercedes diesel pre-chambers could be adapted to create a stratified charge effect. GM's own engineers were reportedly buying parts from Clifford to test ideas that corporate would never approve. The street racing scene was even more brutal. No rules meant no limits. Stories emerged from Van Nuys Boulevard about a primer gray Chevelle with a 6 that nobody could beat. The owner supposedly ran aviation gas with benzene additive 115 octane that let him run 15.1 compression on the street. The engine made peak power at 8,500 RPM and sounded like a chainsaw from hell. When challenged about running a 6 in a muscle car, he'd pop the hood, showing the inline valve cover. Then he'd ask if they wanted to race for pink slips. They never did. The insurance companies inadvertently helped the 6-cylinder movement. By 1970, insuring a big block muscle car as a teenager was financial suicide. Annual premiums could exceed the car's purchase price. But a 6-cylinder Nova? That was Grandma's car. Insurance companies charged grocery getter rates. You could build a 13-second street car and insure it for less than a V6 Mustang costs today. The cops didn't profile 6-cylinder cars. The thieves didn't steal them. You could drive to the strip, race all night, and drive home without worry. Maintenance told another story. A 250 with proper oil changes could run 300,000 miles without rebuild. The same treatment in bracket racing meant seasons without failure. While V8 guys were pulling heads every few months to replace burnt valves, the 6 just kept running. The valve train was understressed even at 7,000 RPM. The bottom end was overbuilt to the point of absurdity. Clifford Performance documented one engine that survived a complete cooling system failure, ran without water for 5 minutes at full throttle before finally seizing. After a hone and new pistons, it went another 100,000 miles. The real testimonial came from circle track racing. NASCAR had outlawed the six in 1955 because it was too dominant. But local dirt tracks had no such rules. The 250 became the weapon of choice for Saturday night racers. The broad torque curve meant you could run one-gear ratio all night. The inline configuration meant even weight distribution side to side. The engine's narrow width allowed radical suspension geometry. Champions were built on 6 cylinders. By 1973, the party was ending. Emissions regulations strangled everything. Compression ratios dropped to 8.1. Catalytic converters killed header sales. Gas crisis meant nobody cared about going fast anymore. The 250 soldiered on as a base engine through 1984, getting progressively more neutered each year. The final versions made just 90 horsepower, less than a modern motorcycle, but the legacy lived on. Every modern turbo 4-cylinder making 300 horsepower owes something to those kids who proved cylinder count doesn't determine winners' circles. The 250 proved that engineering excellence isn't always about maximum power. Sometimes it's about maximum effectiveness with minimum resources. It democratized drag racing, made it accessible to anyone with a few $100 and a willingness to think differently. Today, finding a rebuildable 250 is getting harder. The junkyards are picked clean. But Clifford Performance still exists, still sells parts, still answers phones when someone calls asking about making power with 6 cylinders. The same intake manifold that cost $189 in 1970 now costs $600. But adjusted for inflation, that's actually cheaper. The knowledge base is deeper. The parts are better. Modern EFI and turbos make 500 horsepower achievable from 250 cubic inches. There's something beautifully American about taking an engine nobody wanted and making it embarrass engines that cost 5 times as much. It's engineering democracy, the idea that smart beats expensive, that innovation beats imitation. The Chevy 250 inline-six was never supposed to be a performance engine. It was supposed to be reliable, cheap transportation for people who couldn't afford better. Instead, it became proof that in racing, like in life, it's not what you start with, it's what you do with what you've got. The next time you see an inline-six at a car show, don't walk past. Look closer. That simple engine you're dismissing might be the same architecture that sent big blocks home on the trailer, broken and beaten by something with 2 fewer cylinders and a third of the development budget. That's not just horsepower, that's history. What's your take on the inline-six versus V8 debate? Ever seen one of these unlikely heroes at your local track? Drop a comment below and share your story. And if you want more tales of automotive underdogs that rewrote the rules, make sure you're subscribed because we're just getting warmed up.